Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Renos. Today, we're reflecting back on some of the discussions that took place at the 2025 Africa Growth and Opportunity Research in Action Conference, or AGORA 25. This was the inaugural edition of this flagship platform of the World Bank Group Institute for Economic Development for advancing a new model of engagement with Africa to tackle key development challenges. This model centers on co-creating solutions based on evidence and shared ownership. The conference took place in Palermo, Italy, and brought together policymakers, researchers, think tanks, and international organizations.
It was an amazing gathering that allowed open discussions on key issues, such as the foundational role of physical infrastructure in enabling job creation, with a focus on energy and agribusiness as key engines of Africa's growth, in line with large-scale investment initiatives, country transformation agendas, as well as with key World Bank initiatives like AgriConnect and Mission 300, and with Italy's Mattei Plan. In this episode, we will be discussing some of the key takeaways of the discussion centered around Africa's energy challenges.
Yes, the discussion was quite vivid, and it pointed at the fact that the scale of that challenge is staggering. Participants noted that despite decades of effort, over 600 million people in Africa still lack access to electricity. That deficit creates severe, everyday ripple effects on the ground.
Exactly. Think about a local clinic that's forced to close at sunset, or a school that goes dark, completely stalling business growth. A key theme that came up in the discussions was the need to shape the continent's energy future based strictly on African priorities.
Yes, and that means moving past old paradigms. Throughout all conversations, a common theme emerged: the importance of working with Africa, not just for Africa. The emphasis was on designing initiatives that operate under a new model of partnership, and the Mattei Plan and Mission 300 were highlighted as examples of how this new model can be put to work.
That mindset shifts us directly into the first major theme from the conference, which was about redefining access. While the technology to solve the access problem largely exists, discussions at Agora 25 pointed out a hard truth. The traditional focus on merely counting household connections is no longer sufficient to drive economic transformation.
Most people assume getting a wire to a house is the finish line, but the conversations showed it's just the start. Participants emphasized the need to shift toward what they called a modern energy minimum. But what did they mean with an energy minimum?
It is a measure that sets a much higher bar for what constitutes meaningful, high-quality access. The discussions stressed the need to explicitly target reliable, affordable electricity for productive use by firms. Participants argued they must explicitly target reliable, affordable electricity for productive use by firms, positioning energy as a driver of competitiveness, investment, and job creation.
Ah, that connects the dots for me. So that is why the discussions suggested that these initiatives cannot just expand access, they have to change what access delivers.
Precisely. And that's where one of the clearest recommendations from the conference comes in. Participants discussed the idea of a dual-track delivery system, continuing basic household electrification, while simultaneously prioritizing enterprise feeders, industrial zones, and agro-processing clusters.
That sounds great on paper, but the real question, and this is where the conversation starts pointing forward, is how this actually gets implemented at scale.
This is why I really appreciated that the conversation also pointed at ways to manage this complexity by making an effort to measure impact on both tracks of this dual objective delivery system. To manage it, participants emphasized the need to better measure what matters by moving beyond basic indicators. Useful tools discussed included reliability-focused KPIs, specifically SAIDI and SAIFI.
So these are metrics used by utilities to track the exact duration and frequency of power outages. Conversations highlighted the importance of pairing these with firm-level indicators, tracking impacts on productivity, employment, and growth.
That's the goal. But this is also where the conversation opened up. Participants highlighted that while we know what to measure, there's still a lot we don't fully understand, and that creates a clear agenda for continued research and dialogue.
Right, because you have competing priorities. Participants pointed out that the trade-offs of a dual-track approach remain an open question. We still need to figure out what the right balance is between expanding household access and delivering reliable power for firms, and who ultimately pays for those trade-offs.
Another important point raised was the need to identify what complementary investments are required beyond electricity. And importantly, there's a clear gap in impact measurement, developing robust ways to track not just access, but real economic outcomes like job creation and gender equity.
Which brings us to the second major theme, and it's a big one: the elephant in the room. If there was a single motif running through the conference, it was that institutional quality and governance are the make or break factors for energy transformation.
Absolutely. Without strong institutions and clear rules, even fully funded projects risk underperforming. Participants highlighted a staggering financing gap for Africa's energy transition, estimated between $15 billion and $400 billion per year.
Here's the part that really surprised me. It was mentioned that money isn't the issue. The true barrier is aligning that capital with structurally sound and financially viable utility markets.
Which leads directly into a major policy tension discussed at the conference: pricing and tariffs. Participants exchanged views on the difficult balance between pricing electricity to achieve cost recovery for distressed utilities and protecting vulnerable populations from unaffordable costs.
Here's the tricky part policymakers face. Rather than offering settled prescriptions, participants discussed several approaches to manage this tension. First, of course, was a focus on pricing to cost recovery over time. But some participants pointed at the need to protect the most vulnerable, for example, with well-targeted cash transfers that are kept entirely outside the utility tariff system.
Another approach discussed to protect the most vulnerable was using time-bound, data-validated lifeline blocks. Those aim to protect the poor while still reflecting true system costs. It's about creating practical safeguards.
That conversation ties back to a broader recommendation that came through very clearly. Reform has to be the entry point. Without viable, well-governed utilities, neither Mission 300 nor the Mattei Plan will scale.
Exactly. Participants pointed at the fact that many countries are exploring tools like performance contracts and regulatory reforms to shield utilities from short-term political pressures. But they also emphasize that reform is deeply political.
And that's where the uncertainty really comes in. We still need much better understanding of the political economy, who wins, who loses, and how to build coalitions for change.
Definitely. More work is required to design incentive structures that bring potential losers into reform coalitions, and to determine what concrete reform milestones could unlock larger-scale financing. Questions that are likely to take center stage in future AGORA discussions.
This was also highlighted as a major open question. Can a strong reform agenda help scale up initiatives like Mission 300 and turn them, potentially, to Mission 500 or even Mission 600?
And alongside that, another unresolved issue emerged: risk. Who should ultimately bear the risks associated with climate variability, asset performance, and payment default?
Right, whether that falls on governments, multilateral institutions, private investors, or insurers remains an open debate, and one that requires much deeper analysis.
It really does. And when you step back, what AGORA 25 made clear is that we are no longer short on ideas. We are at a point where delivery, alignment, and learning become the real test.
Exactly. The conference didn't just diagnose problems, it laid out a direction. Focus on institutional reform, align financing with real impact, integrate regional systems, and keep African ownership at the center.
And that's where the anticipation builds. Because if Agora 25 focused the discussion on hard infrastructure needs to create growth and opportunity in Africa, Agora 26, that is the next edition of this conference in the fall of 2026, will bring a complementary focus on the human infrastructure needed.
It's about testing the dual-track model in practice. It's about seeing whether reliability for firms can truly be embedded as a core objective. And it's about whether reform milestones can realistically unlock the scale of financing that participants envisioned.
And just as importantly, it's about answering the open questions on trade-offs, pricing, risk allocation, needed complements, and political feasibility through real-world experimentation, data, and continued dialogue.
Because as one speaker put it, development is not an event, it's a relay. And Agora 26 will allow us to come together again and continue the conversation, exploring solutions, addressing key research questions, and building the partnerships needed to generate lasting results for Africa. Over to you, Renos.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website. Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.